Hello everyone, and welcome to my nerdy Excel spreadsheet walkthrough for Elden Ring. I'm your host, Colors Fade. Over spring break, I streamed a bit of Elden Ring, and during that time, viewers caught a glimpse of the Excel spreadsheet I use to navigate the game. This is a spreadsheet that I put together for myself, as I do with many games, and I had no intention of ever releasing it to the public. However, after some viewers expressed interest in getting their hands on it, I changed my mind and decided to make it public. If you just want the spreadsheet, you'll find a Dropbox link in the description below. If you would like to know more about how the spreadsheet is organized and my approach to playing Elden Ring, then stick around. A lot of this information won't be news to veterans of the game, but it should be helpful to new players. So if you're new to Elden Ring, you may find this walkthrough very helpful. If that turns out to be the case, let me know. The spreadsheet is broken up into two vertical halves. The left half contains several charts, like my preferred target stats for specific builds, the exact values of the various soft caps, a chart of equipment loads, a list of priority items I like to pursue, and several other tables such as specific talisman bonuses that I care about, armor sets I covet, and the location of the various smithing bell bearings, which are the key to leveling up many of the weapons you'll find. This is all information that I have to reference each time I play the game, so to save myself from having to visit one of those god-awful wikis full of seizure-inducing ads, I just append this information to the left half of the sheet. The right half of the sheet is the walkthrough proper. I am by nature a completionist, and unlike a lot of other players, I don't care that much about New Game Plus. To me, a huge part of the fun is the progression of going from a weak character with no equipment to a powerful contender for the Elden Throne. I thoroughly enjoy the experience of a fresh game, and even though I've beaten Elden Ring more than 10 times now, I still prefer to complete as much of it as possible each time I play. Thus, this walkthrough is fairly exhaustive. I don't want to say it's complete, because there is the possibility I left something out, but for the most part, this covers all the important content in the game. Locations, NPCs, quests, every piece of static armor and weaponry, ashes of war, spells, incantations, talismans, physic tiers, cookbooks, and a few other important items as well. What I did not do, however, is notate every single piece of mundane loot. There's just far too many. There are times, however, when you'll see minor loot notated in the spreadsheet. This is because some of the locations in the game, particularly some of the interior dungeons, can be a bit confusing to navigate, so to help with that, I'll note the minor loot as a reference point. Toward the top of the walkthrough, you'll notice a key that shows how I color code the information. I'm a real big fan of color coding because it helps me scan for information faster. The left-hand column of the walkthrough always references a site of grace. This is the starting point for every note that comes after. For bosses, I typically list their strengths and weaknesses, and any relevant gear or tactics I favor for defeating them. For some of the more difficult bosses, the notes are more extensive. One thing you won't see me mention a lot is spirit summons. My first few times through the game, I leaned on spirit summons heavily, but I eventually reached the point where I wanted to solo every boss. That was the reason I put this walkthrough together, so I'd have a clear plan for achieving a completely solo run. The only time I used spirit summons was during one specific battle where I believe that was the intended design. In all other instances, I soloed the content. I figured if the walkthrough works for soloing the game, then it will certainly work for anyone who wants to use spirit summons. I also want to mention that this walkthrough is tailored for my favorite build, which is Dex, with a smattering of Faith mixed in for buffs. But I have beat the game with every other build, including Strength, Intelligence, Faith, Dexterity, and Arcane. In the end, I've come to enjoy the Dex build the most, but I also really like Intelligence and Faith builds. Obviously, a character's build affects how a person prioritizes the acquisition of certain items. And since Elden Ring is a big open world, you can approach this game's content in any order you like. Since my preferred build is Dexterity, I prioritize items that enhance that build, and thus the guide favors those items. If I were aiming for a different build, I'd prioritize items differently. For instance, if I were aiming for an Intelligence build, I'd track down the Meteorite Staff, Rock Sling Spell, and Moonveil Katana as early as possible. Likewise, if I were aiming for a strength build, I'd acquire the greatsword as quickly as possible. If you're familiar with the game and know what build you want to use, it's easy enough to search the guide for those items and come up with a plan to acquire them in whatever order you desire. The rest of this video, I just want to highlight certain points of the walkthrough and pass along some things I've learned that might be helpful to new players. Before I run down the important points of the walkthrough though, I want to take a minute to talk about starting class and two of the more important mechanics in the game that players tend to overlook. If you're a new player, you should start with whatever class tickles your fancy. Respecking is easy once you reach the Rhea Lucaria Academy. For myself, however, I always start with the bandit class nowadays because it begins with the buckler, which is the best parrying shield available until you can acquire Carry and Retaliation at the Caria Manor. I've become a huge fan of parrying because it's perhaps the strongest mechanic that players have access to, and I've gotten to the point where I don't want to start a new character without a way to parry. You can, of course, make do with a rickety shield or a riveted wooden shield, both of which aren't too difficult to obtain in the early game. Or you can acquire the parry dagger from patches as well. But since the bandit starts with the buckler and has good stat distribution, I choose it. In addition to the buckler, the bandit also has very low intelligence and faith, which means I'm not wasting points in spellcasting stats that I might not use. Even if I were to play a full intelligence or faith build, I'd still start with the bandit class, because early on I don't need spellcasting abilities and I'd want the buckler in the early game anyway. Plus, I'd want to first build up my core stats in vitality and endurance, and then raise my dexterity and strength to weapon minimums before I worry about spellcasting. In addition, one can obtain a Sacred Seal and a Sorcerer's Staff very early on, so there's no reason to start with the other classes just for their equipment or a small boost in the primary stat. Finally, the bandit's poor starting weapon doesn't concern me, because it's literally the first piece of gear I'll be replacing. Bottom line here, you should play whatever starting class you want for whatever reason you want, but I would encourage everyone to learn how to parry. Whatever your preferred build, whether it's intelligence, faith, strength, dex, or arcane, everyone can benefit from parrying. The other mechanic I want to highlight right off the bat, besides the importance of parrying, is guard counters. This is a mechanic that I ignored for a long time because I didn't understand how it worked, and the game doesn't do a great job of explaining it. But much like parrying, it's a very powerful mechanic, and it was further enhanced with new equipment in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. Shields, and any weapon when you equip it two-handed, can be held up to guard yourself from attack. Guarding blocks a percentage of damage, and that amount is denoted as the guard boost of the shield or weapon. Each time you block an enemy's attack by guarding, it blocks a certain amount of damage and subsequently consumes your stamina. But protecting you from damage is only part of the reason to guard. The more important reason is because it also allows you to perform a strong follow-up counterattack, called a guard counter. This only works after blocking an enemy's attack, and it only works with a strong attack as the follow-up. Light attacks will not trigger it. Using a strong attack, following a guard, will cause a chime to sound, letting you know that you're performing a guard counter, and thus any benefits to that type of attack, such as the boost granted by the Curved Sword Talisman, will apply. With the right combination of talismans, you can turn a guard counter into an incredibly high damage attack. But to reiterate, this only works with a strong attack as the follow-up. A light attack won't trigger it. The neat thing about having a parrying shield equipped in your offhand, like the buckler, is that you are equipped to do both things. You can either parry or you can guard counter. You can parry an enemy if your timing is good enough, but you can just as easily hold it up, guard counter instead. I wish I had known all of this the first time I played Elden Ring, because I would have leaned heavily into both of these mechanics. Instead, I spent the first half dozen playthroughs just trying to dodge everything, which is not the best approach in a lot of situations. The early portion of Elden Ring is one of my favorite parts of the game. There are so many critical items that one should obtain. But when you're a new player, it can be a little overwhelming to figure out where to go and what to do, or even know what's important. My first stop, of course, is always Vade to start his quest, and then Kale to purchase the crafting kit, because at a minimum, I'm going to want to craft bone darts, flame pots, boluses, and crystal darts as the game progresses. Kale sells a couple of the crafting cookbooks, but you won't be able to afford them right off the bat. That's okay, we'll come back later. After that, it's off to the gate front side of Grace for Torrent and the first Whetstone, as well as the Lord Sorn's Greatsword. If I'm shooting for a strength build, I'll be using this weapon for quite a while. Returning to the Church of Ella gets us a visit with Arena and our first Spirit Ashes, the Wolf Pack, which, if you level them up to +4 or +5, are actually very good against certain spellcasters and bosses. Then it's off to Aguila Lake, where I'll pick up the Twin Blade. For any other build that's not a strength build, this will be my main weapon for a very long time. Personally, I love the Twin Blade moveset, but I understand if it's not everyone's cup of tea. The more popular weapon, Bloodhound's Fang, is also a short distance away in the Everjail. If that's your style, knock yourself out. I prefer to go east after that to speak with Alexander and get his quest started, because his talisman is so important to so many weapons. Then it's off to speak with Kenneth Haight to start his quest. From there, I'll stop off at the Third Church of America to pick up the Flask of Wondrous Physic and the Sacred Blade Ash of War, a short distance to the north. I don't know about anyone else, but I use Sacred Blade a lot against anything that's vulnerable to holy damage, especially annoying enemies like the Deathrite birds. And of course, it excels at dispatching the undead, as you don't need to kill them twice. After that, it's a short ride south to Fort Haight for the most crucial early game Ash of War for my build, the Bloody Slash. With this on the Twin Blade, we can now go visit Grail for an early game boost. First though, we need to make a quick stop near the coastal cave to snag a Golden Pickle Foulfoot. And then it's time to head back to the Third Church of America to take the portal to Caelid to make our way to Grail for a bunch of runes. Veteran players know about Grail and use him to give themselves a nice level boost early in the game, but most players make a mistake. They allow him to die. Grail can be preserved for additional farming by simply hopping on Torrent and activating the Site of Grace right before his vanishing sound chimes. All one has to do is watch his health bar carefully, and the moment his final chunk of health is stripped off, summon Torrent, dash to the Grace, and activate it. You don't have to actually be on Torrent swinging away at Grail when you do this. You can still have time to summon him, dash over there, and jump off, and that's how I do it. You'll still get a boatload of runes this way, but Grail will remain alive for subsequent farming, and that's the important part. Now, I'm sure many veteran players are going to say, just use the flail you find at Gatefront, or just use the mace you find in Weeping Peninsula because they both have bleed on them. And yes, you can do that if you like. However, the Bloody Slash Twin Blade is significantly faster at dispatching Grail for one, and not only that, I like to have it in the early game because it's going to be my main weapon for a long time. And since it's really easy to run up to Fort Haight and get that Ash of War and put it on the Twin Blade, I just prefer to do it before going to see Grail. Once I have a boatload of runes, I'll level up both my character and my weapons. The reason I like to keep Grail alive is because quite often, when I obtain a new weapon I want to use, I lack the runes to level it up. The Smithing Bell Bearings will allow you to purchase all the smithing stones you need to level up a weapon, with the exception of the Ancient Dragon smithing stones, but doing this can require a hefty sum of runes, especially when you're in the endgame. Grail makes this easy though. One can also utilize certain farming locations in the game, but I find on a first run before New Game Plus that Grail is the fastest means of acquiring a lot of runes. From here, the rest of the walkthrough is pretty straightforward. I've optimized the order of locations to suit my needs, but you should use it however you want. The most important thing for me after this is to get to Liurnia, get through Caria Manor, and get the Carrion Retaliation Ash of War for a shield because it's the best parry in the game. After that, it's just following the walkthrough and getting things in the order that I want them. That said, before I close out this video, I want to pass along some of the things I've learned that might help new players. When you first begin the game, you might not notice it, but you have 6 quick access pouch slots available. 4 of these pouches have a button combination to allow instant access of their contents. You should definitely take advantage of these pouches for storing things like the lantern, Torrent's calling charm, and consumable or crafted items like boluses or throwing darts. This will keep your main quick access free of clutter, which will make it easier to rotate among your HP and FP flasks. Nothing sucks more than having to spin through several quick access items to reach your HP flask when you're in the middle of a frenetic situation. I've seen people put their FP and HP flasks in the pouches, but the problem I have with that approach is that you can't see the amount of charges remaining. Speaking of pouches, one of the items you should obtain and keep stored in a quick access pouch is Margit's Shackle. You can acquire this item very early in the game by visiting Patches in Merkwater Cave in Limgrave. He's a boss when you first encounter him, and you'll have to fight him, but you don't want to kill him. Show mercy and he'll turn into a vendor. The shackle he sells has a far more useful function beyond incapacitating Margit. The shackle's ability has a very large area of effect, and interestingly enough, it actually causes all traps to toggle their state and will reveal all illusionary walls. So keep this thing on you and use it. Also very early in the game, you'll meet Brother Corin at the Round Table Hold. You should purchase the incantation Heal from him, as this will become one of the best ways to deal with one of the most annoying enemies in the game, the Revenant. These fiends will rise up unexpectedly in certain locations, and their frontal flurry attack will send you to your grave. However, if you have Heal at the ready and a Sacred Seal equipped to cast it, you can stun these enemies, allowing you to follow up with a critical hit. At higher levels, this will finish them. Heal will only stun them for a short while though, so you really need to hit them with this from the front while you're facing them so you can follow up with the critical hit. But still, I find this approach far easier than actually having to fight them in close quarters and just straight up melee them. A lot of annoying enemies in the game have weaknesses like this, and you just need to figure out what those weaknesses are and exploit them. Something I didn't realize when I first started playing Elden Ring is that throwing pots are a renewable resource. For some reason, I thought you lost the pots when you threw them, and since you don't find a lot of pots in the game, I thought it was a complete waste of time to craft anything with them. However, pots magically return to your inventory after you throw them, allowing you to craft with them again. For this reason, I've notated every cracked pot, ritual pot, and hefty cracked pot in the game, so you won't miss out on looting any of them. I suggest making liberal use of throwing pots, especially the fire ones, because they can make certain enemies a lot easier to deal with. And it's for that reason as well that I also recommend looting every single mushroom you see and every smoldering butterfly you run across. Another thing you'll see mentioned in the walkthrough quite a bit are crystal darts. These will confuse the hostility of certain types of enemies, making them hostile to any other creature nearby, not just the player character. This is particularly useful against the annoying imps in the catacombs, as well as the Erdtree burial watchdogs and the hulking smiths in the DLC. Having enemies battle each other while you come in and clean up afterwards can make a lot of situations easier to deal with, or at the very least, fun to watch. When it comes to weapons, you'll notice there are minimum stat requirements, and the game will tell you that you are unable to use this item effectively with present attributes when you don't have the required stats. What this really means in practice is that you can still use the weapon, but you won't be able to use the Ash of War on it until all stat requirements are met. So you need to poke points into your attributes. However, strength is a special case. When you two-hand a weapon, your effective strength becomes 1.5 times your normal value. The game's UI doesn't show you this, unfortunately, which is why it can be troublesome for new players to understand what's happening. But trust me when I tell you, if your strength is 20, like my character's strength is here, and I two-hand this weapon, my strength is now 30, which is enough to effectively wield the Fire Knight's Greatsword and use the Ash of War. Another mechanic I feel worth highlighting is power stancing. Whenever you're dual wielding the same type of weapon in each hand, you can power stance for added damage. What effectively happens is that the button you would normally press to guard will instead perform a specialized moveset unique to those two weapons. This moveset only works when the weapons are of the same type. For instance, 2 straight swords, 2 great swords, 2 katanas. You get the idea. When power stancing, the amount of damage each weapon individually does is slightly less than if you were swinging it one-handed doing a regular light attack. However, the power stanced attacks will, for the most part, occupy the same amount of time as a regular light attack. Thus, you get the benefit of each weapon's damage and any extra status effects like bleed. And if you hit both weapons at the same time, like on a jump attack or the final attack in a chain, you'll do massive damage. Personally, I've become a huge fan of power stancing, especially katanas and greatswords. For a dex build, the katanas are an absolute blast and will cut through things like butter, And for a faith build, the great swords are massively fun. Plus, you can do things like swap the weapons in your hands, so you can use the Ash of War of one, and then you can use the Ash of War of the other weapon. One thing that can take a little bit of time is using the map to travel to sites of grace far away from where you currently are standing. However, you can favorite sites of grace and then access them from a quick menu. They get added to their own page in the map listing, and this can make it very quick for traveling back to places like the Round Table Hold. A quick series of button clicks immediately gets you there. On PC, for instance, this becomes G, F, F, and then you click. I recommend favoriting specific sites of grace that you find yourself going back to over and over again, especially things like farming locations or places for quests. This will make navigating the game and the map just a lot easier. Something else players may not realize is how to escape a dungeon. When you enter a dungeon and bring up the map, you'll notice that every site of grace is marked with a red slash, and you're unable to travel to any site of grace unless you exit the dungeon. However, after you defeat the boss of the dungeon, this red slash goes away. Every dungeon will give you a teleport back to its entry point, but you don't need to use it, because once the boss is dead, you can go anywhere. Another item I wish I would have known about earlier in my Elden Ring experience is the Twiggy Cracked Tear. You find this at the base of a minor Erd tree on the north side of the capital outskirts, guarded by an Omen and his minions. When placed in your flask of Wondrous Physic, it prevents rune loss for 3 minutes. I don't know about anyone else, but I hate losing huge chunks of runes, because the further you progress in the game, the more expensive leveling becomes, especially in the DLC. This is why you'll see the walkthrough mention that you should zero your runes prior to entering a certain dungeon or fighting certain bosses, because death is likely. The idea here is to use whatever runes you have in your inventory to level up, and then go into the encounter with nothing to lose. But the Twiggy Cracked Tear makes that unnecessary, because it prevents rune loss for 3 minutes, and typically, if you're gonna die to a boss, you're gonna die before Twiggy's effect wears off. But I also like having this ready for non-boss situations that can get dicey, or if I have to do some platforming. There are times, of course, when I'm using certain weapons that I want both physic tiers for offensive output or some other purpose, and in those cases I'll leave Twiggy on the shelf and zero my runes instead. But the vast majority of time, I have Twiggy in my physic, especially against difficult bosses, because it saves me from having to worry about rune recovery. When I'm fighting a tough boss, I really just want to worry about learning the moveset and winning, and not about recovering my runes every time I enter the arena. There are, of course, many more topics I could cover if this were a true newbie guide, but that would make this video much longer than it already is, and truth be told, it's probably already too long. That said, before I go, I want to discuss one more topic that I think is important.
And it's rule number 9. Always use the right tool for the right job.
You've probably heard the old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's the approach that I see far too many players taking to the game. And I'm not talking about veteran players doing things like random challenge runs. I'm talking about players sticking with one loadout for absolutely no reason other than they're stubborn. Elden Ring doesn't have a quick way to swap loadouts, but in my opinion, you absolutely should swap your weapons and talismans as the situation warrants. Of course, you're free to tackle the game however you want. Maybe you have roleplay reasons for sticking with things the way they are. That's the beauty of this game. But if you want to be effective at this, you should know that you're making the game more difficult by not optimizing your gear for specific enemies. This is why I specifically mention enemy strengths and weaknesses in the walkthrough. I do that mostly for bosses, but there are times I'll mention it for other enemies as well, and it's simply because knowing the weaknesses and swapping gear to attack those weaknesses will make your life easier. A couple of good examples of this are the Finger Creepers, the Deathrite Birds, and the Furnace Golems in the DLC. Finger Creepers are weak to fire. Not only that, but fire will cause them to roll around defensively on the ground for a while, taking damage. This is great when you have to deal with a crowd of them, because while they're rolling around, they're not attacking you. So you should definitely take the time when you know Finger Creepers are coming up to swap to fire weapon. Deathrite Birds have an erratic and awkward attack pattern, and some of their attacks can be devastating. With enemies like this, the best strategy is to dispatch them as quickly as possible. Holy attacks do a lot of bonus damage to Deathrite birds, which can turn these painful battles into very brief encounters. Thus, I highly recommend when you deal with enemies who are vulnerable to holy, switch to a holy weapon. Sacred Blade is your friend. Furnace golems can be made to fall down, allowing for a critical hit in the face. But to make this happen, you need to break their poise. However, unlike the other enemies in the game, using a weapon that does more poise damage won't break a furnace golem's poise faster because their poise is only affected by raw damage. Since they are weak to strike, fire, and lightning, it pays to use weapons that exploit those weaknesses to stack up poise damage as quickly as possible. Power stancing lightning katanas, for instance, causes a lot of raw damage to these monsters very quickly, allowing for fast crits and a short battle. Across the entire game, you'll find enemies that have exploitable weaknesses. Some enemies are very sturdy against melee damage, but fire pots melt them. Some enemies are vulnerable to bleed, while others are vulnerable to cold. Some can be outright killed with a heal incantation. Knowing these weaknesses will allow you to adjust your Ashes of War, utilize greases and buffs appropriately, and tweak your talismans so you are doing the most damage. I promise you, if you take this approach to the game, you'll have an easier time, and you might actually find it fun. And to reiterate once more, take the time to learn the parry and guard counters. They're game-changing mechanics. Alright folks, that's it for this video. If you found any part of this useful, please let me know. And if you end up using the Excel spreadsheet, let me know that as well. As always, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, happy gaming everyone.